We can all agree that hot spotting fishing places is a scourge. But here's an actual hot spot. Hot, but far from secret. When I last fished the Firehole River, opening day 2021, the water temperature there had already reached 72 degrees. Obviously, one doesn't go to Yellowstone National Park over Memorial Day looking for solitude. Missoula is a heck of a lot closer to lots better fishing. So why go? For a very long time, I'd been meaning to revisit a special stretch of water on the Firehole that I first fished over a half a century ago. After the difficulties of recalibrating to college after returning from Asia, it was a centering joy to discover fish rising to mayflies in late May. Over the next several springs, irreplaceable memories were formed on that stretch of water with several fishing friends. An African kid from a tour bus once walked several hundred yards across the bison crop meadow to ask John Ryan and me, how much are those clubs for fishing? How to answer. I was fishing my new Leonard 38H. Ryan had his sweet Fenwick Fairlight FF79, the rod he would tragically break a year or two later in an alcohol-enhanced gesture while driving back to our camp from the stagecoach. In 2021, family logistics finally allowed for a nostalgic return. Of course, one thing that's changed is that a fishing license is now required in the park. I've been back to the park many times since that halcyon days of the early 70s. During the 1988 fires, I got to buzz over the Firehole in a helicopter. With COVID restrictions lessening, it was no surprise to see license plates from essentially all the states. For some reason, that year the entire subcontinent of India decided to join the rest of Asia for a look-see. EVs and hybrid vehicles have become common in the park. Maybe someday the National Park Service will solve the congestion caused by thousands of individual vehicles clogging the roads in the park. Oops, sorry, that was a thought phoned in from 1971 that intruded into the 2021 narrative. Madison Junction Campground, where tents have twice collapsed on me during late snowfalls, should really be renamed Conspicuous Consumption Campground. Most of the spots were occupied by huge motorhomes. Ted Trueblood would weep. Anyway, all the campsites there were booked months in advance. Motel room prices in West Yellowstone now rival downtown Manhattan. Foreshadowing. I stealth camped in my 4Runner. The only other overnighters had 4 legs. The actual fishing? Setting up next to the Midway Bridge, I talked to 2 Bozeman guys who fished the Firehole opener every year. Yankee Jim with a bridge over his shoulder, and Pierre, shown here releasing a fish shortly after 7 o'clock. I wanted to fish the stretch starred at mile 8.5 in this treasured little pamphlet. In the 70s, we could drive all the way to Goose Lake to get there. The Park Service has steadily pinched back how far you can drive on Fountain Freight Road. The north end was once gated at the Iron Bridge at Ojo Caliente. Now the parking lot is about a third of a mile short of the Hot Eye. I had resolved to throw only dry flies, ideally patterns familiar a half century ago. First up was a fly we used to call a brown spider. I got the pattern from A.J. McLean's book, The Practical Fly Fisherman. His description of our quarry's intellect still delights. A well-read tyer lately correctly identified the fly as a wingless Wickham's. That simple fly has always worked when the fish were on tan caddis there. It took just 4 casts for a vintage fly to fool my first erratically rising ring. Here's a closer view of gold-bodied brown spiders tied back in the day. Must add hooks, baby. As predicted, the white Miller caddis showed. I don't recall seeing them in the old days. Various caddis dries worked well enough on these unsophisticated opening day trout, both browns and rainbows. To my great pleasure, the best pattern of all was the one I've taken for my handle, the Rio Grande King. Small ones tied dry with antelope belly hair wings. The mayfly emergence was spotty at the pool where I was forced to post up. Opening day 2021, you just seized a spot and held it all day. Guys slightly downstream reported seeing a big flush of PMDs. A few fish seemed to be eating emergers in the foam above me, and I caught a couple on a low-riding emerger. It was a tarted up pattern based on what Swisher and Richards called pale morning dun number 1 in selective trout. A trimmed hackle version of the spinner described there fished great in the early 70s. In retrospect, I think that fly was being taken for an emerger. Didn't have any of the originals left, so I tied something similar. The 21st century flies were tied on Daiichi 1480s, a limbrick bend, straight eye, 1x fine wire, 2x short hook. Delicate iron, but good hookers and plenty strong enough for today's firehole. Tails were all of hackle fibers as called for in the original, but this time topped off with gold-dyed teal or wood duck for a more emerger look. Body was these flies' PMD porcupine quill spiraled over the tying thread. Thorax was an olive and dun blend. Whiting pale dun hackle was wound through the thorax and clipped top and bottom to float in the film. These versions of the PMD duns there never got deployed. It was mainly a caddis show, though. I never put on waders. Precisely at midnight, back at my illicit camping spot, I was rudely awakened by bright flashing blue and red lights. A pair of NPS law enforcement officers very politely suggested that I not camp there again. I probably won't fish the Firehole ever again either, but it was an intriguing and decidedly mixed pleasure